Designation of the property located at 300 South Palm Canyon Drive is a Class 1 historic site, and as well a planned development district for a mixed-use project at that site. We're taking these as one item, one public hearing. There'll be one opportunity to speak in the public hearing at 3 minutes apiece. And staff report, please.
Yes, Mayor Punier, members of the City Council, as just described, this is two actions before you in this hearing for the property at 300 South Palm Canyon. And the first is a recommendation from the Historic Site Preservation Board that they adopted in March of 2007 to designate the property as a Class 1 historic site. The Council took up this issue on April 4th, 2007, and by a vote of 3-2, continued the public hearing on the historic classification until the proposed Barista Lofts project was brought before you, and that's why we are here tonight. So I'd like to first talk about the historic classification recommendation. The city's own Historic Resources Ordinance, Chapter 8.05 of the Municipal Code, provides the opportunity to designate properties of historic merit by the city, and that comes before you after recommendation from the HSPB, the Historic Site Preservation Board. The staff report on pages 3, 4, 5, and 6 identify the issues associated with this recommendation, and probably the critical issues are, one is that the building itself is a well-preserved, well-detailed example of the architecture of the mid-century and is recognized as one of the best works of the architect. And so that is a major portion of the recommendation, and is staff supports the recommendation for designation of the building for Class 1. The other aspect of this property is the land around the building, and as you see on page 5 of the staff report, staff believes that the frontage of the building facing both Barista and Palm Canyon contribute to the historic merit and architectural significance of the site, and we are recommending that the historic designation include that area of land between the building and the street frontages. The Historic Site Preservation Board also included in their recommendation the full site, including the parking areas to the west or the east and south of the building. Staff does not support that element of the recommendation and believes that the building and the street frontage areas are all that should be preserved in a designation. And you'll see on page 6 the elements of the building that we believe help justify the recommendation for designation, and we are recommending to you, after you take your public hearing testimony, that you adopt the Class 1 designation for the building and those portions of the site between the building and the street frontages. The second portion of the project is the new development proposed on the south side of the site. This is a 4-story building with 19 residential condominiums on the upper 3 floors and commercial retail use on the first floor. The new building is 45 feet in height and consequently is defined as a high-rise structure, which makes it subject to either a CUP or a plan development approval. The applicant has submitted a plan development because the project as proposed needs relief from a number of zoning standards, including setbacks, density, and the quantity and design of off-street parking. More specifically, 88 parking spaces are required, 81 spaces are provided. Staff believes that the most significant element of the plan development is the elimination of the rear and front setbacks. There are zero setbacks on the rear and front setbacks in order to allow the building to fit onto the site, and staff is concerned about this much density and volume and mass placed so near property lines. That is why staff has recommended and identified this as a project which we recommend to you, but as a close call. It does meet the intent of the general plan, the densities allowed by the general plan, but its placement close to the setbacks gives the planning department some pause, and also created some concern for the Planning Commission. For when they reviewed the project, they voted on January 2009 on a 4-to-1 vote in favor of the project with 2 commissioners either abstaining or absent from the vote. There are conditions of approval that are recommended associated with the project, both with the historic preservation recommendation as well as with the new development proposed on the site. Those are all attached in draft resolutions and draft conditions of approval, and I'm available to answer any questions on those items if you have any. Otherwise, this is a public hearing for these 2 items, and we are available for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. Any questions of staff before we open the public hearing? Okay, seeing none, we will open the public hearing at this time. And first we'll have, who's speaking for the applicant? You'll have Mr. Chiaffi, 10 minutes. Come up to address either the historic site status or certainly the PDD application.
I'm going to talk about the PDD application.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council. James Chiaffi, I'm the architect for the project. You're going to hear a lot of emotional testimony tonight about Palm Springs modernism and tourism attraction and things like that. And I'm not here to refute any of that. I'm a firm believer in this existing building. It's one of my favorite buildings, too. But I was asked to try to put a project together on this site that would help us revitalize our downtown and help us bring a new vitality and density to the downtown core. And so that's what you're going to see tonight. Rick is going to play a little video movie. This is a 3D model that we created. It's about 3 minutes long, and you can watch it as we go through. We can play it again if you'd like. We can even stop it. I'm going to concern myself more with some facts that you need to know about. We were approved by the Architectural Advisory Committee and the Planning Commission, a 5-1 vote at AAC and a 4-1 at Planning Commission. I think we had 1 abstention in the Planning Commission. The reason it was approved is because it does meet density and mixed-use concepts that the downtown revitalization guidelines have asked for. And so that's what we did. It's a mixed-use project, obviously, with for sale condominium units and a retail space below. The fact is also that this is a scaled-down version of an office tower designed by the original architect. Easter Williams designed a 5-story tower on this site that went from Palm Canyon to Indian Canyon. I think that's in your packet. You can see sketches of that building. Another fact to consider, while we're asking for setback reductions because of the ordinance, it still is within the height limit of the downtown plan. And the fact is that most of the proposals that will react to this downtown renovation plan won't meet the city high-rise standards. So at some point we're going to have to decide what we want to do with those standards, and if we want to get the mixed use and the density and buildup of our core to help our downtown, we may need to revisit those things. And the last fact is the building, the new building doesn't touch the existing building. It's 16 feet away at the ground plane. It's built over an existing parking lot on the service side of the property. For those of you that know the property, that side is the parking and the service stair down to the mechanical room. It's basically windowless. In fact, right now is covered with ficus trees. And so we thought that was okay. It was the service side, and it didn't affect the pavilion quality of the existing building. That's mainly on the, only on the north and west sides of the building. So, again, we feel very strongly this project doesn't negatively affect the existing structure. It carries out the original architect's intent, and most importantly, it adds an element of vitality to the downtown plan that we're all interested in bringing forth. So, and that's the video, and I'm available for questions, of course, and I'll also like to rebut at the end of the hearing.
Yep, you'll have a 2-minute rebuttal opportunity at the end of the public hearing.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, we will now move into our list of speakers, which we have several. So each speaker will have 3 minutes. And our first speaker is Eric Williams, followed by Jacques Coucil. Sorry, Jacques. I never get that right.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I'm Dr. Eric Williams. I reside at 2602 Canyon South Drive in Palm Springs. I've lived in Palm Springs for over 60 years, and I am the son of the late architect E. Stewart Williams, who designed and built the Santa Fe Federal Bank in 1960. To put that date in a more personal, historic perspective, 1960 was also the year that I graduated from Palm Springs High School, and that's almost a half century ago. The fact that so many people here tonight and elsewhere continue to admire the bank's design gives testimony to my father's architectural vision and sensibility. The bank is an elegant and simple pavilion-style modernist design with glass curtain walls open to the desert light and mountain views. It is without a doubt one of the best designs of my father's long and distinguished career of more than 50 years, and it helped to architecturally define and distinguish Palm Springs in its formative years. The architectural integrity and character of this iconic building is now threatened by the Barristo Lofts project before you tonight. My father did not object to multi-story development, as long as it decreased density, preserved or created open space, and did not encroach upon or overwhelm surrounding development. In fact, he even designed a multi-story office building adjacent to the bank at a time when Santa Fe executives were considering a larger development called Santa Fe Plaza, which extended from Palm Canyon Drive all the way through to Indian Avenue and included a large open-air pedestrian plaza overlying an underground garage. Contrary to my father's design objectives, the Barristo Lofts project increases density, it eliminates open space, and it fails to respect a certain territorial imperative needed to preserve the bank's architectural integrity. Its height and close proximity to the bank appears to overwhelm and compromise the simple elegance of Santa Fe Federal Savings Bank. My father would never have suggested, approved of, or supported such a project. In his acceptance speech upon being honored as a Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, my father stated, "Art in architecture is elusive. It becomes art only when it truly touches and elevates the human spirit. To capture that moment is why I became an architect." Well, for me and my family, and for many people I've met and known over the years, this building captures that moment and raises our spirit far above the level of mere existence and mediocrity which characterizes so much of urban development. Its architectural excellence deserves to be protected and preserved. I urge you to deny the Barristo Lofts application and to designate Santa Fe Federal Bank and the property on which it stands a Class 1 historic site. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Our next speaker, Jock, if you'll come forward, then Richard Serafin, followed by Peter Maruzzi. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council members. My name is Jacques Cossin. I'm a year-round Palm Springs resident, and I vote. I do not think I will need actually 3 minutes to tell you about my opposition to the Barristo Lofts, mainly because it's only one word, which is one question: why? From an aesthetic standpoint, why would you let a beautiful building be smothered by another building standing merely 4 feet away? Do you remember when you were growing up seeing in your history books drawings showing how houses were built right next to cathedrals during the Middle Ages? In the ensuing centuries, all these houses were purposely torn down so that the architecture of the cathedrals could be better appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Santa Fe Savings and Loan is a modern-day cathedral. So please, let's not go back to the Middle Ages. From an economic standpoint, why would you want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg? By that, I refer to the thousands of people who flock to Palm Springs all the time to discover and enjoy the trove of mid-century architecture that has given a new life to our city for the last 10 years. These are upscale tourists who spent a lot of money when in town. They're from all over the country and even the world. During this last Modernism week in February, I met English, French, German, and Australian visitors. We doubled the number of architectural tours from last year, and yet all the bus tours sold out within a month of the show. So please think of the goose. And remember, please ask yourselves why. Thank you.
And thank you. Kip Seraphin.
Good evening. My name is Richard Kip Seraphin. I'm a full-time resident and business owner here in Palm Springs. I'd like to read to you one of the many over 90 emails that you received against barista lofts. You were all sent a copy, and it's from Brent Harris, owner of the Kaufman House. Subject: the importance of the mission in the city, maintaining our modernist heritage. It is the firewall between success and bankruptcy. As the owner of the Kaufman House, and I think at least partially responsible for the city's financial and cultural resurgence in recent years, I need to voice my opinion on architectural improprieties occurring in this town. I increasingly find that in some ill-defined view of development that the city bends over backwards for developers who don't have virtually any check or balance on their activities. The Barista Lofts project is such an oversight. I expect others to fall into this category, and knowing the financing for both residential and commercial projects, believe that several prominent developers will go bankrupt in the next 18 months, likely in mid-project. I have hope that you can add some sanity to this council, and one that is on the verge of backsliding on holding up the remaining crutch that keeps the city an interesting place for tourists and retail dollars to flow to. Being in the financial business, managing director of PIMCO, the world's largest bond investment management firm, and knowing the hundreds of billions of dollars put into malinvestment in new homes and commercial construction in the United States in recent years, I hope to impact to you the diversity of the downturn the city faces. Please vote against any more of this malinvestment in the city. It will ultimately lead to tears. I made the investment in the Kaufman House when people shook their heads at my insanity of what was I doing. Yet, I think over 15 years of ownership, I've instilled a change of attitude and pride in what can be done, but my vision was set in 1993. That is a different environment than 2009. Many other homeowners have fixed up their residential modern homes, and the Modernism Week, which I've witnessed the blossoming of since 1997, is the direct result of this. Let's try, against the receding tide of the economy, to make things as good as they can. Thank you for your attention to this vote at this crucial time. Sincerely, Brent R. Harris, owner, Kaufman House. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marusi will be followed by Gary Wexler and then Michael Stern.
Honorable Mayor and council members, you've already seen this image up on the wall, so I don't have to show you how close the building will be. The new development would be to the historic building. More specifically, though, to address the question of what E. Stewart Williams had in mind when he proposed a multi-story building for that site. The key issues to note are the building that he proposed is set back much further from Palm Canyon Drive to allow views of the building from different directions, unlike Barista Lofts. Also notice that the second story is raised on thin columns that give it more breathing room between the existing building and what was proposed, which is not the case with the Barista Lofts, as you can see. So to claim that this was something that E. Stewart Williams would have approved, I just don't think is appropriate given these images. Secondly, in terms of designation, around the country, it's you designate an entire site, not just a building. That's why it's called the Historic Site Preservation Board. That's why it's a Class 1 historic site. To just designate the building is not correct, because the building sits within a setting which is its own parcel. You're designating a parcel in most cases, and that's how cities handle these types of nominations. So please consider precedent when you look at the issue of what you're actually designating, if you so choose. Finally, we have a great number of people here tonight who don't feel comfortable speaking, but want to at least be acknowledged for their presence. And many of them are wearing these lovely badges that were prepared by the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation. So why don't you all stand up, who came in support of the position that I just articulated. Wow, more than I thought. Well, thank you all for coming, and that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Gary, then followed by Michael Stern and Bob Hebling.
Mr. Mayor, City Council, my name is Gary Wexler, 3680 Bogart, Palm Springs. I am a native-born and lifetime resident of Palm Springs. I'm joined here tonight with my father, architect Donald Wexler, and we're here to both praise the beauty of Stuart Williams' design and also to voice our opposition to the Bristol Lofts project. I'm particularly sensitive to architects, the way history looks on architects in this city, and there are few that deserve as much pride that Stuart Williams brings to our community. Looking back at what Stu Williams wrote in his 1979 book on the Palm Springs Desert Museum, he wrote, "What makes a building unique is its response to the total character of its site, and therefore site is often a generator of form and character of the building." Well, he succeeded beyond all our expectations with Santa Fe Savings and Loan Building. He wrote later about the process of architecture. This is the emotional part that you were warned was coming with public comments. He wrote, "Like a symphony which is composed of many parts, each part must be individually written long before the integrated whole can be presented to the audience. The architect, like the composer, may be responsible for the basic theme, but as a conductor, he is totally dependent upon the consummate skill of those playing the separate parts. As a result, architecture is often considered by many a skilled craft, yet it becomes art when it rises above the level of utility and into the realm of self-expression and the human spirit. Almost 50 years later, this building continues to be recognized as one of the architect's great contributions to the city. Tourists travel from every corner of the world to visit Palm Springs to appreciate such buildings. And with this building, architect Stuart Williams rose to that level of self-expression and created for all something that must be viewed as art, and that art is site-specific. So the history of Palm Springs lives on through buildings like this, and residents and tourists now and 50 years from now embrace these buildings and these architects, and they respect them as time capsules of the human spirit. So please do not allow the Bristol project to continue. Thank you.
And thank you. Michael Stern.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, and staff. My name is Michael Stern, and I live in Palm Springs. We are all so lucky to live in a place that is now world-renowned for its large collection of mid-century modern buildings. Amidst this shimmering architectural landscape, several buildings stand out as being true masterpieces. The Kaufman House, Victor Gruen's Bank of America building, the Elrod House, and 300 South Palm Canyon is among this very elite group. Some buildings grab you by the shoulders and shake you, and other buildings make grand statements through their sublime understatement. 300 South Palm Canyon is a case in point. Though it doesn't club you over the head, it mesmerizes you with its flawless sense of proportion, elegance, and refined details. It is amongst the best buildings that E. Stuart Williams has ever built, and that is saying a lot. This is an architectural statement that should be celebrated, not overwhelmed to the point where its simplicity is lost amidst claustrophobic walls of an overscaled building that gives no breathing room to this elegant jewel. There are sensitive ways to develop around a historic property that increase the value and visibility of the historic property to the benefit of the development. That is not the case here, as this historic property is dwarfed and smothered by a 4-story building that at certain points is only 4 feet away from this historic property. When Stuart Williams designed an additional building to the project, it was done with complete sensitivity to the 1-story structure and with a different property boundary that was able to accommodate this additional structure. I applaud the Historic Preservation Board for recognizing its importance and singling it out for its very justifiable designation as a Class 1 historic site. Many of the great buildings in Palm Springs have been demolished or renovated beyond recognition, but this great jewel remains brilliant, radiant, and undamaged. Perhaps a development can occur on this property that will celebrate the masterpiece in its midst, as opposed to treating it as an inconvenience. Let's create a future that celebrates our past. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Bob Hebling, who will be followed by Greg Felson, and then Brian McGuire.
Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and council members. My name is Bob Helbling. I'm also a permanent resident of Palm Springs. I'm not going to criticize the architecture of Jim Choppy. He certainly served this city well over the years and served on our architectural advisory board. But I want to cite what he said when he opened his statement. He was asked to do something by the developer, and he did what they asked, and he did a good job. The question at hand is, what was he asked to do? Now, I've been a supporter of development for this site for a long time, and I want to reflect back to those standing members here, and the ones you can remember when Anna Escalante was standing here making a presentation for what we then called the South Bookend. There was a lot of concern about the massing and the density of the building, but as Councilman Mills pointed out, and a lot of us agreed, the building was stepped back and gracefully moved back on the site, so as you looked up, it had a rather pyramidal effect as opposed to a blocky effect. And before I actually saw this design, I sort of expected something like that to happen behind the Stuart Williams building, because really what you have is you have a rather blocky mass up against this elegant pavilion building, and I think that some setbacks, some angular work, something to, maybe it would cost a couple of units, maybe it's not cost effective, but right now I think the big objection is how it masses up against this very sensitive and delicate building. Now, we also have to keep in mind that when Stuart Williams had his ideas of what this town should be and what the space utilization of the open air should be, he lived in a different era. So now we're looking forward to a time when, although we're, as I like to say, more than halfway through our current recession, we have to plan for where we're going to be a number of years down the road. So we have to make decisions that are intelligent for the future, but I think in this case, it's just a little too much for a building that is so revered by so many here. And it's not the only pavilion around. I mean, I can take you around Los Angeles and show you a lot of nice pavilion designs similar. But what makes this one rather special to me is the way it is sited and the way it floated around that corner. And I think we need to preserve that. And I think that Westman Development will eventually come to something that, hopefully will come to something that can be accepted. But in the meantime, I think it needs more. I mean, when I hear the hesitance of our staff and all, just everybody wants to approve something, but right now I think that it's really stepping on too many sensitivities and it needs some more work. So I know, Mr. Mills, you will do your thing, and each one of you will have your own opinion, but I think you need to listen to the public on this one. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done yet. And you know that I support Mr. Westman when the projects are right, and I believe they're right. So I say this not to take aim at anybody, but I think it's really time that we look at this and our future. Thank you.
And thank you, Bob. Greg Felson, Brian McGuire, and then Patrick McGoon. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Greg Felson, and I'm a professional photographer who has been visiting Palm Springs for about 20 years and recently relocated here from Minneapolis. One of the subjects I enjoyed photographing most in Minnesota has been historic sites, and I'm working on a book about that subject in Minnesota, and I've photographed approximately 400 of the 1,100 sites in Minnesota. While here in Palm Springs, I've become very interested in the historic buildings here in Palm Springs, and have photographed many of the mid-century modern properties and Class 1 historic buildings for a possible book that I might be doing here as well. I hope that this site is protected from future changes for the present and future benefit of everyone who lives in Palm Springs and the people that visit here who love that sort of architecture. Thank you.
And thank you. Brian McGuire.
Hello, my name is Brian McGuire. I am not an architect, an historian, a city planner, or a lobbyist, but I am a homeowner here and I love Palm Springs. A sufficient number of people have already remarked on the architectural and historic significance of the Williams-designed bank building, so I'm not going to repeat that. What I would like to do is to respectfully point out to the City Council members your custodial duty to the heritage of Palm Springs, and to remind you that each project you approve in the city is part of your legacy and how you will be remembered. The proposed Barista Lofts project has been described by others as insensitive, disrespectful, devoid of public benefit, and downright ugly. I really don't think any of you want to be remembered that way, especially the ugly part. Please respect the structure that's already there and give it room to be appreciated by those of us who do value our heritage. Rather than cramming an unnecessary building into a tiny sliver of land, perhaps instead the developer can find a way to fill the giant hole in the middle of downtown that was to have been Port Lawrence. That would have public benefit. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Patrick McGrew, who will be followed by Charles Sachs, and then Jade Nelson.
Well, good afternoon, Mayor Prunier, council members, staff. I am Patrick McGrew. I am an architect, and somebody's got their cell phone on. I'm an architect and writer who has specialized in California architectural history for several years. And I, too, am not going to tell you how fabulous the building is, because it's a masterpiece, and everybody knows that. I think the issue I'm most concerned with, and that's what I brought this panel for, to sort of give you guys a little background. I did this same presentation before AAC a couple of years ago and wanted to talk about historic architecture. I mean, all the way from Palladian villas on forward, there are certain kinds of architecture that are objects in space. And that's what this building is. If you look, and I just got a little detail here of the site plan, but the way the site plan works, by sitting on the corner and developing the L-shaped parking lot and also taking in the street space, which is also L-shaped, you really do get an object in space, and that's one of its actual defining characteristics. A lot of people have referenced this building to the Barcelona Pavilion, Mies van der Rohe, 1929, even the famous Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier, which is a perfect object in space, and then Philip Johnson's Glass House, very similar in many ways, except that it's a private residence instead of a bank, but nonetheless an object in space. So taking that thought, the point of the designation is to encompass that character-defining feature. If you suddenly, I mean, I come from a town, I worked in San Francisco for 40 years, and we had row houses, and you had property line walls and property line development, and that was perfect for a city. But for a place like Palm Springs, where you have these kinds of pavilions, you got no other choice. Is my time up? No. So what I decided to do was to take those same pavilions and show you what they look like if you put a 4-story building up next to them, or maybe 4 feet away. And, you know, as it turns out, the government of Spain has chosen not to do that. The government of France has chosen not to do that. The National Trust, who owns the Johnson House, has chosen not to do that. And, you know, it's kind of like, well, Stu may have been a kind of a hometown boy, but this is kind of the best link to world architecture that we have in this town. I mean, Neutra notwithstanding. So it's really important to understand the value of the site. So please designate the entire site.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, sir. And just as a reminder, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Thank you. Jade Nelson, followed by David Christian. Oh, Charles Sachs, you're next. I'm sorry. Didn't I have Charles? Yep. Then Mr. Nelson and Mr. Christian. So, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. Sorry I wasn't here 3 weeks ago for the 75th anniversary, or excuse me, the anniversary of the Titanic.
Well, you were here last year. For
But
that.
yes, well, 3 years ago I baked the cake for you, and it crashed. If you remember, for the Titanic, it went down. But today is the anniversary of the Hindenburg. So, in memory of the Hindenburg, this is my Hindenburg tour canceled when it crashed T-shirt. So, in reference to this property, I think one of the issues we have to always realize is that at the right time, there's the right place for everything. And with this particular building, I mean, we need all our visual heritage in the city so much. And it's always a great concern of myself as a historian when we see in my area of maritime history and aviation how great ships are lost for some reason or other, are not preserved properly. Like the Norway, which is the biggest liner in the world, was trashed, and the QE2 is now in Dubai, and that's going to be maybe into a hotel, maybe survive. But will that vanish? And the key thing is when we have these wonderful structures, we should try to preserve them within the community. So on this anniversary of the Hindenburg and 100-degree plus temperature today, let's have not succumb to any hot flashes, but let's save this property so we'll always see it again in the future and not succumb to being surrounded by something less appropriate. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Sachs. Jade Nelson, then David Christian. And David is my last speaker. If there's anyone else who'd like to speak in the public hearing, if you'd come over to the side and give your name to the city clerk. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council, city staff, and fellow citizens. My name is Jade Nelson, and I'm here in support of the Class 1 designation of the building and land on which the East Stewart Williams Santa Fe Bank building is located. I am not supportive of the Baristo Loft project proposed immediately adjacent to this building for many reasons. Many of those reasons you've already heard from others here tonight, or you've received countless letters stating architectural and historic preservation concerns for the building and site. I agree with those letters, as well as with thousands of citizens and visitors alike who voiced their desire over the years to see this site designated Class 1 and protected in the state that the architect intended it for generations to come. My larger concern today is with the property owner and his company's continued disregard for the buildings and site that constitute an important part of Palm Springs' heritage and its architectural legacy, as evidenced by their treatment of such buildings they own. I find it ironic that said developer would go out of their way to purchase and or develop on or near historical sites. This company owns at least a dozen commercial buildings downtown, of which 4 are certifiably historic. 1 is part of a Class 2 site, 1 is for sale, and 1 is built on the former Streamline Modern Bullock's building site by renowned architect Welton Beckett that the city unjustifiably allowed to be demolished. At many of these buildings, one can see obvious signs of badly deferred maintenance and neglect, specifically at the community church, where piles of newspaper and dry leaves pose a fire hazard, not to mention the blatant neglect at Town and Country Center. Why someone with little apparent regard for historic structures would choose to buy them and or develop on or around them is puzzling, unless, of course, the intent is to ignore them and to allow them to become blighted, therefore causing demolition by neglect. This is what's known in legal limbo as cumulative impact, and this developer is certainly guilty of it. His actions, or rather lack thereof, have resulted in a systematic ruining of our downtown corridor and the very heritage that created it. We elected you to hold developers accountable for such action. Many of our local landmarks have been grossly affected. Obviously, the largest one being the Fashion Plaza, once home to the charming historic Desert Inn and now a Class II historic site. Town and Country Center had water damage, rotting wood, peeling paint, and neglected landscape. Plaza lost floors and dirty stained walkways and broken doors. I could go on, but I know the picture is crystal clear. Is this the fate that we want for one of the iconic buildings of a beloved local and prolific architect who adopted Palm Springs as his own hometown? Better yet, is this the fate we want for our city, often referred to as the American Mecca for original mid-century modern architecture? I don't think so. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. My name is David Christian. I've lived here I'm an architect in the area. I've lived here for 39 years now. Architecture is at its best, I think, really enhances people's lives by the vitality of a structure and the way the interaction of that structure with the people that are in its vicinity. Excuse me. And this is a great and vital building. Everyone knows that. No one's arguing it. And as Mr. Chiaffi stated, it's one of my favorite of Stu's works as well. It's probably is my favorite. But in reality, I think a Class 1 designation that's being proposed right now moves us into sort of a now what mode. And I think the now what mode, it sort of puts it into like it's going to either be a museum or it's going to be something else. And something else is one of the things that's being proposed right now, and the museum aspect won't happen. It's just not going to happen. I mean, you can't take every historic building in this town and set it up as some sort of shrine. It's just not feasible in the real world. And this building is in good condition right now. There are other buildings that aren't doing so well, historically very significant buildings in this town. And I would point to the Oasis Hotel as one, that it's a shame the condition of that building right now, but economics have kind of put it in that condition. And this building's a strong building, it's a vital building, and it's capable of thriving on its own. I don't think it needs there's a tremendous amount of love for this building by a lot of people in this town that are not speaking today and that aren't trying to preserve it as some dead thing in a way. And that's, I think, something that would happen if this building receives a Class 1 historic classification. I think that there are many well-intended people here. We all have a common love for this building. That's one of the ironic things about this group. We do share a common love for the building. But I would urge the council not to kill this building by trying to save it. And don't turn Palm Springs into a museum of dead buildings. It's kind of going in that direction already. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak in this public hearing? Yeah. City Clerk's got your name.
Hi, my name is Robert Stone. I'm a Palm Springs homeowner and full-time resident. I had not intended to testify today, so I thought someone else would make the point that I'm about to make, but they didn't. I don't think this is a good project. I don't think it's sensitive to the historic architecture. More importantly, I don't think it's a real project. I don't think the developer has any intention of building this project. And we have two real estate licensees here tonight sitting on the DS, and I think that you can confirm the truth of what I'm about to say. In a down market, when there's not a significant profit potential in building new construction, what a developer does to increase his profit down the line is to secure entitlements, to cram more buildable space onto the property that he owns. That's a minimal expense, doesn't require him to build anything, but it takes up a tremendous amount of staff time, of council time, of citizen time attending hearings and considering proposals that really aren't going to be built. With this developer, we have a history of unbuilt projects. We have Crescendo, we have Boulders, we have Museum Market Plaza, which has remained unbuilt and unimproved for a decade now. I think that this is real estate speculation at the expense of the city of Palm Springs. And I think we have an opportunity here to change the relationship that the city has with this developer by not allowing this to continue. I hope you will turn the request down. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak in this public hearing before I ask Mr. Chiaffi if he'd like his rebuttal time? Seeing no one else, Mr. Chiaffi, would you like your 2 minutes?
Thank you again. And I'd like to just say to all my colleagues here in the front row, especially, and some of them are friends of mine, others are acquaintances and respected peers, I have no issue with the East Stewart Williams building. It's my favorite building as well. But I have to reiterate what I said earlier, and I'm extremely fearful that that the designation at this present time, without any plans for adaptive reuse of that structure, will destine it to failure. And I'm really worried about that. I've seen that happen before. We've got boarded up historic structures now in our downtown, so that was my first thing. I spoke to the Planning Commission, I guess about a year ago or maybe a while ago, about the question of balance. And I know that we need to balance our redevelopment efforts with our preservation. I think we can have the best of both things. This building is not 4 feet away. It's 16 feet away at the ground plane. It has an overhang that's within 4 feet of the existing overhang, and then it steps back away from that. So I want to make sure that's clear. I want to repeat that this building brings vitality and a mixed-use element to our downtown plan, which is what we all are trying to do. I don't know of much else going on downtown right now, and not that we would say that this is an end-all to that, but I think the Planning Commission would agree with me. In fact, they did agree with me on that. It's projects like this that will strengthen our downtown, and if there's compromise to be made, then so be it. Maybe we'll make some compromise. But we're here willing to work and listen to people, but most importantly, we need to get these kinds of projects to densify our core and prevent sprawl and do all the things that we're trying to do downtown. So maybe we can find a middle ground here. I hope we can, and move projects like this forward.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chiaffi. Okay, with that, we will close our public hearing. Council, questions? Staff questions? Mayor Pro Tem.
Mr. Mayor, just a request.
Yes.
In that we separate the votes on the two items, and that we deal with the PD first.
Mr. Holland, is that something that we can do? You took them all as one item in the public hearing.
No, that's true. You did take them all as one item. I guess the council can act on it in any order that it wishes to. There is an introductory issue that the council is going to need to address, and that's the question that deals with the adequacy of the environmental, and that's going to have to be addressed regardless of which item goes first. So I don't think that it really matters which way that the council wants to discuss it.
Okay, so we have a request by Mr. Mills. Ms. Foat.
Well, I don't think we can separate them, because had we separated them, then people would have had an opportunity to speak on the PD and then had an opportunity to speak on the historic site. When we originally wanted to separate these, it was a request that we not separate them, that we keep them together. So we've now not allowed the public the opportunity to them thinking that it was one issue to speak on the PD itself. So I would be against doing that unless we open up the public hearing or notice it again so that people can speak on the actual plan development.
Any other comments, Mr. Weigel or Mr. Hutchison, on the request?
Well, I think I agree with Ms. Foat on this. I think, this is the way this item was noticed. This is the public hearing that we had. I think we should probably address both of them together.
Mr. Mills?
I don't understand the logic of my colleague's statements here. Both these items are on the agenda. Whether we deal with one or the other, they had and we heard people speak to both issues. So I don't think that anyone's going to feel cheated if we separate these items in our vote. I mean, I don't know how we kept the public from talking about either one of these items, and that both items are listed on the agenda. The fact we separate issues all the time we can pull out. We pulled out a track map from a PD. We pulled out different things from one application. These are actually listed as two different projects or approvals. So I don't really agree with my colleagues on the comment that we didn't give the opportunity for someone to speak on the issue by itself, because the opportunity was there to speak on both. So I think we're probably going to figure out. I mean, I don't know how we do this, if we just make a request of all of us and see what the outcome is.
I'm going to ask Mr. Weigel, and then we'll have discussion.
Well, I tend to believe that if the council chooses to separate them, that we can separate them. I would be in favor of separating them, and I would be in favor of discussing the PDD first myself.
See, if we separate, I would like to take the historical designation first, because I wanted these separated 2 years ago, and they weren't. So I would, if we do separate, that's where Mr. Holland, was never come up in council. If we do separate, do we look for a council direction on which one to take first?
Mr. Mayor, I think that these things were noticed as a hearing for the convenience of the public and for the council. The council can divide this up and take whatever action it wishes. It has received complete testimony on it. Which order it wishes to follow, that's going to be up to the discretion of the council.
Mr. Hutchison.
Well, I think we always have the opportunity for someone to make a motion to amend what we're voting on, and then we can see if there are 3 votes to vote on just that thing or not. That would be one way to sort that out.
Okay. Mr. Mills.
And I'm certainly not trying to belabor this, but as a council person, I've got several comments on the designation and several comments on the PDD itself. So when I'm going to address my comments, am I going to address both things at once, or for simplicity, I'm trying to separate it?
Yeah, I'm all for separating them. It's just if we separate them, I would take the designation first, and then the PDD second. So I think there seems to be some degree of interest in separating them for clarification. So I will make a motion that we do separate them, and that we take the historic site designation first.
Second.
Do we need a motion? Just agree. All right. Okay. All right. Let's just then, no motion necessary. Is there a consensus, or at least a majority, to move the Class 1 historic site designation forward first? Yes. Okay. So be it. So now we will address questions here first to the historic site designation. And Mr. Holland, if there's anything that we need to continue to do as we move through there, please let us know. So questions or comments to the staff regarding the Class 1 designation of the Santa Fe building? Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The city attorney was starting to tell us that was going to comment on something to do with the environmental aspect of this. So, and I'm curious too. I think all of us are, as to what the implications are in, since we have separated these, in doing the effect that the approval of the site, at the historical designation of the property has in relationship to the PD. Assuming that one and we are doing the HS,
Yeah, we're
the
doing
historic
the
site
designation first.
So from an environmental impact standpoint, from a negative deck standpoint, from all the things that occur in CEQA,
Well, from a practical standpoint, you're being asked to look at a question as to what should be designated as historically significant. Staff is recommending that you designate the building and certain surrounding or certain adjacent open space. I believe the Historical Preservation Board recommended that you designate the entire site. If you were to designate the entire site, then you may want to consider as to what you're going to then do with the project as a whole, simply because then there's a question as to what impact that development is going to have on that entire site. Clearly, a significant portion of the site, if not all of the site, is impacted by the proposed development.
Say that all again.
Let's try that again. If you were to designate the entire site as being historically significant, as opposed to staff's recommendation of simply designating the building and certain adjacent areas, so you went with the entire site, then there's a question as to what impact that then has on the PDD when it comes up for consideration. And there is a real question as to what extent and whether or not that the environmental that has been done on the project has adequately addressed any kind of mitigation measures that would be necessary and the overall environmental effect. I think some of the arguments that have been advanced in regard to the adequacy of the EIR would definitely be called into play if the council were to designate the entire site as being historically significant.
And Mr. Mayor, hence my request to do the PD first, meaning if the PD is not successful, then the designation of the building / site may be viewed separately or differently. So that was my reason for asking for the flip, but
Okay. Rick?
Well, to move this along, I would like to move that we adopt the Class 1 designation as recommended by the HSPB, by the Historic Site Preservation Board, which includes the building and the surrounding site, because I do find persuasive the importance of not just the building itself, but the perspective all around it and the space all around it. So I would prefer that we have a Class 1 designation of the building and the site, use the resolution recommended by the Historic Site Preservation Board rather than the resolution recommended by staff. So that would be my motion with respect to the first piece.
All right, so we have a motion and a second on the floor. Discussion, council. Mr. Weigel? I'm sorry, Mr. Mills.
Could staff point out to me what that recommendation is in our staff report, where the exact recommendation of the HSPB is?
Page 26. The last bullet at the top of page 26 is, I believe, the only difference between the two resolutions.
Hold on, okay.
Mr. Mills, any further questions, or I can jump to Mr. Weigel?
Please do. I'll
Okay.
have some more when I
Okay, Mr. Weigel.
read this.
I guess this is just in the form of discussion. I guess my main questions had to do with the PDD itself. This, I'm having trouble with this because we have a property owner here who has said that he would like to participate in this building being a Class 1 site. But he is the property owner, and I don't think that we should be taking the rights away from a property owner by declaring the entire property a Class 1 site, thus effectively saying he can't do anything else with this property. And I just, philosophically, I have a problem with that. So I am not in favor of that motion. I would be in favor of a motion to name the building a Class 1 historic site.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Weigel. Ms. Foat.
I don't think that you can take a building, and I love those pictures that one of the speakers showed. Otherwise, we should just designate a large portion of land somewhere in Palm Springs and move all the buildings that we consider historic to that piece of land. And I think you all see how silly that sounds, because it's not, where the Empire State Building stands is where the Empire State Building stands, and where this building stands, this building. I remember coming into Palm Springs and looking at that building for the first time, and then having to go back and look at that building because I couldn't figure out how it was standing there, and that appearance of the building floating, and when you see architects come up and talk about it, and the Williams family knowing what was planned for that site, it wasn't what we see here. And so if I'm looking coming north on Palm Canyon, I wouldn't see that building until I was right next to the building. Because there is no setback. It's towering above. It would seem to me to be like if we put a 9-story building or a 5-story building outside of City Hall. And because of the architectural importance of this building, it's not just the structure itself, it's where it stands. And the historic sites are the fabric of our city. And I think that what we heard and what we've seen as council members in ModCom Week and the people that come to this city to see our treasures, if we are not the stewards of those treasures, then we've failed at our job. We're recognized worldwide, and we're recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And many of our councils before us have kept properties that people owned or that people wanted to develop in other ways, and they protected them. And we're very proud of them today, and we use them in our pictures, we use them on our website, and this is one of those. I remember when, and I've told this story before, I lived in New York City in a building that was about to be torn down had it not been for historic site preservation. And the building looked terrible. It was falling apart. It was 17 stories high, and I could never understand why that building was being preserved. And I ended up living in that building at one particular time after it was preserved, and got to know the history of that building and what was planned in that building and what had happened in that building. And it was a 17-story building that had a dairy on top of it. And the basement of that building was where the baths that Bette Midler got started in. And, you know, it had some really...
Where are you going, Miss Vogt?
You could rent an SRO type room in that building for like $30 a week. A friend of mine just recently sold their condo in that building for $4 million. You know, it's because people who believe and look at the history and work hard to preserve it. And I don't know if I would have felt differently about this whole site if Mr. Westman had moved that building back and kept the land envelope around the bank building, but not, the way it is now, there is no way that I could ever accept that. So we have a responsibility on this council, and we share that responsibility with property owners in this city. And I think that I'm willing to do my job to preserve the things that are important in this city. Unfortunately, we have property owners who are not willing to do their part and preserve that history. And I would have to agree with one of the speakers that came up who said that we have buildings that are so architecturally important that are being allowed to go to ruin. And we handled this with the last meeting with the La Serena Villas, and I feel very strongly that this entire property now needs to be designated so that it doesn't get towered over and squeezed in and lost for the beauty of the building. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Vogt. Mr. Hutchison.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Weigel's comment about property rights with respect. But if we were to vote and approve the Bristol lofts as proposed, frankly, it would have an impact on the property rights of the adjacent building, because this proposed building has a zero setback, which would mean, as a practical matter, you couldn't build a building next to it with a zero setback. So decisions we make always impact property owners and adjacent property owners. Second, I don't know that we foreclosed the ability for something to be built on this lot. I think, as Mr. Holland said, it probably would require an environmental impact report if there were to be a future proposal for a different, more modest development, perhaps closer along the lines of that proposed by Mr. Williams originally. And third, I do think, as Ms. Vogt said, that it's our responsibility. I mean, the developer, any property owner, has a perfect right to make a proposal, either within our zoning ordinances or to propose a PD and ask that they be waived for one reason or another. But we have a right and an obligation as a council to look at it from the perspective of the public's interest and to say, is this in our larger interest or not? And so, in my view, I think it is completely respectful of property rights of this property owner, of the adjacent property owner, of the property rights of all of us who live in Palm Springs, for us to designate not just the building, but the surrounding site as a Class 1 designation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Councilman Weigel?
Well, I'm not going to speak with total authority on this, but I think in the Central Business District, we don't have to have setbacks between two properties, do we? Can't we build buildings in the Central Business District right next to each other?
That's correct. The side yards are zero.
So this does not affect the next door property. And I hate to designate something as a historical site just to keep the property owner from using the property, for building on the property. That does not seem to be a good reason to me for designating something as a historic site. I don't think anybody in this room wants to see that building go away. I was here when that building was built. And if you look at the photographs of that building from the south, you'll notice that it's always from the southwest toward the building, because you couldn't see that building from the south in the southeast, because there were other buildings there, and there were shrubs and trees. It was never, it didn't sit all by itself on that piece of property where you could see it. It didn't sit like a podium. I remember that specifically when I was growing up here. So there are a lot of things that we're making assumptions about that the architect intended at that time. The best testimony I think that we had was from Mr. Williams, the son, who could speak to his father's intent. But again, I reiterate, I don't think we should be designating something, the entire site, as a historic site just so we can keep the property owner from building on it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weigel. Mayor Pro Tem Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think, and I think Lee's absolutely right. I don't think there's anyone in the building who thinks this is not a Class 1 historical structure by anybody's standards. I think the hesitation I have is with the entire site. I think it's important to note if you look at the photographs, the black and white photographs up there, there's already been a retaining wall that was on both street sides that has been removed, and in my opinion, really affected the look of that structure. And I think it's unfortunate that even that happened. And so we're not looking at a building right now that was the original envision, or a site anyway, that was the original vision of the architect. I think that his platform feel was enhanced by that retaining wall, and the height of that retaining wall, and the type of landscaping that was in there was all done to enhance the look of that building. It certainly did it. One of the hesitations I have in designating the entire site is, then if somebody wants to come back and put up that wall that was there before, then they've got to go through the entire process to put the wall back that was originally there, number one. Number two is we are designating, and we designate the entire site, we are designating a parking lot and a trash enclosure. That's what we're designating, because that's all that's on that site, exclusive of the building and the two street frontages. So if someone wants to come back in and make a modification to that parking lot, they've got to go through the full Class 1 process to do that, which I think it's unfortunate that that's the process that it would have to go through, and that's the hesitation that I have on the site itself. I thought the recommendation by staff was a good one in dealing with just the frontages in front of the building, because it left opportunity for improvement of the rest of the site. And that opportunity of improvement doesn't necessarily mean a 45-foot high structure. It could mean a one-level structure. It could be, 1.5 level. It could be anything. But now, if this becomes designated, anything you do on that site has to go through a lengthy and expensive process. When I don't think that we really need to do that, the council is the ultimate decision maker on a Class 1 or any modification thereto of a Class 1. The council is also the final decision on anything that happens on that site if it chooses to be. So the control level in my mind is already there. Why complicate the issue for any minor modification that might want to happen to that site? I mean, if the landscaping changes, and the site designated, it's going to have to come in. And that's the frustration I have with designating the entire site. The photographs that we saw of very pertinent architecture is unfair to take, number one, a residential property in a wooded setting and compare it to a downtown site in any city. I appreciate what we saw, but it's very unfair to equate the two. I think that I'd like to refer to the HSPB recommendation in the staff report prior to that, because there's some misinformation in there that I would like to have modified. And I'm not the perfect one on dates, but I'm looking at page 25, and the second paragraph. It's important to remember a collection of buildings in this vicinity that developed in the 50s and 60s as Palm Springs Financial District. That's not really true. As Mr. Williams mentioned, the Santa Fe building was started in the 60s. The only one I could think could possibly be in the 50s was the B of A, but Union Pacific Bank was built in the 80s. Guarantee Bank was built after that, and the Wells Fargo Bank, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Wexler's out there somewhere, was built in the 80s as well. So there's some misinformation in that portion of the staff report that I think, however this goes, that needs to be straightened out. Going over to page 26, I'm looking down at, under section 3 at the bottom of the next to last paragraph, number 2. All future exterior modification, including not limited to building site, landscaping, et cetera, approval pursuant to section 94.04, Palm Springs Zoning Ordinance and Historic Site Preservation Board, et cetera, et cetera. Craig, I don't know exactly what 94.04 is. I do know what the Historical Site Board review, but it's interesting that it says shall require architectural approval pursuant to section 9.4, but why doesn't it not say Planning Commission approval, and why does it not say ultimately City Council approval? I mean, why is architectural approval pulled out when if I'm not mistaken, architectural approval is part of that ordinance? So that's one thing. So I don't understand why that's written that way. And then down from that on number 3, regarding no permanent alteration of the exterior, et cetera, defining elements and characters shall be issued without prior approval by the Historic Site Preservation Board. I don't understand that, because they are not the ones that alter any Class 1 building. It's the City Council that ultimately modifies any Class 1. So why even have that in there? It should be going through the normal process, which is Architecture Review, Planning Commission, HSPB, and ultimately City Council. So I don't know how this gets written this way. And which was why I mentioned that I really needed to understand what, when you say the HSPB recommendation, it really, number 3 goes against what our zoning ordinance says.
The HSPB review, once a Class 1 designation is established by the City Council, review of alterations is by the Historic Site Preservation Board and would only come to Council on appeal. So this reflects the correct procedure under Section Chapter 805 of the Muni Code under Item 3. Item 2 identifies Section 9404 is the architecture review process, and the Historic Site Preservation Board review per Muni Code 8.05.180 is the particular section. So that and these reflect the city's rules in this matter. Any exterior modifications are subject to architectural approval, not architectural advisory committee approval, but architectural approval, which is a staff-level review with the reference to the AAC if necessary. So this is correct.
But so it doesn't require a planning commission approval?
When there's no new square footage added, no. Only when square footage is added does an architectural review go to the commission.
If there's a modification proposed to it, it's got to go for architectural approval.
That architectural approval, yes, but
Which is planning commission.
No, not necessarily. The zoning code identifies a break in the process of architecture review. Staff can approve changes to buildings as long as no new square footage is added, and that's in the zoning code. When new square footage is added, then it must go to the planning commission.
You mean like the addition of the automatic teller to the...
That's correct. That was a staff level review, and that's authorized under the ordinance at staff level.
Then I think 3 should be if you're going to write the process in, then the appeal process should be written in there too.
We can do that.
Because the implication is that it's final with HSPB, and that's the problem I've got.
Okay.
And so I would request of the motion and the second that we look at that modification to the staff report, and then the modification to 3, I guess it is.
So the accuracy of when buildings were actually built in the text there on page 25.
Yeah, and I think to Craig, and correct me if I'm wrong, we all know the unfortunate circumstance of the ATM to the Coachella Valley. We've set up a system so that doesn't happen again. Is that correct? Something similar to that would not happen again?
Yes, we flag all of the properties that are designated and all those that are surveyed, and so those now come up in our data research so that we catch those.
Okay, so you don't see any necessity to modify number 2?
Well, we can certainly clarify it if you don't think that it adequately represents it. It does state the correct sections and does state correctly, if maybe too simplistically, what the process is.
In support of Mr. Mills' point there, I'd also point out that the same language appears on page 20, 21, and 22,
Okay.
because both the staff recommendation and the HSPB recommendation have the same language.
Okay.
Yeah. The main difference between those two resolutions is the bullet point Councilmember Hutchison mentioned at the top, distinguishing between all sides of the building or those street frontages. That's the only distinction between the two resolutions.
And then also, Mr. Mayor, I just like to add that I think we all know how this vote's going to go, but I don't. I mean, it really bothers me to vote no on the designation of this piece of property. But because as we've all heard, I mean,
right.
it really bothers me. But the only reason that I'm voting no is as I expressed on the relationship to the entire site, and so I just would like to mention that, and it bothers me to have to do that.
All right, we will reflect that in the minutes, depending on, certainly on the vote. Ms. Vogt?
Yeah, I just wanted to question something, or ask a question about something that Mr. Weigel brought up, and I think has been cleared up a little bit by Mr. Mills's questioning as to the process that the owner of this property would go through to build something on that site. And can you talk a little bit about that?
The on an undesignated property, new construction on commercial property goes through.
No, I'm talking about just if this was
If it's
to be
designated,
designated
okay,
the
well
entire
then,
site.
if the entire site is designated, any change to the exterior of the building or any features of the site would be subject to both architecture review and historic designation, historic appropriate review. Two processes, one to the architecture staff and perhaps the architecture advisory committee, the other to the HSPB.
And so square footage could be added,
A new building.
another building could be added.
Any change would go
So
through
we
that
are not
process.
taking away the property owner's right to build on this property by designating the entire site a Class 1. We're just making it a little bit more important that the developer go through another step so that it fits into the site itself. So I just wanted to clear that up because I think from Mr. Weigel's question, I was feeling that I was confused and maybe the owner of the property could not ever build anything on it at all, but that's not correct. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So this, so I guess I get to say something. This is actually, yeah, I mean, this is very easy for me because 2 years ago I wanted this separated for a very simple reason, so we could have this discussion, because I think everybody then and everybody now, and the case is even more convincing now, that to me the entire site is certainly historical. So that is an easy decision for me to make this evening. And I think that you've got to remember this. Every sensitive piece of land in the city is going to have a different process. When someone purchases a piece of land, certainly they have the right to develop, but they also know that if it's really sensitive, it might be a little bit more tough to develop, whether it's in the Chino Cone, whether it's downtown, and where it is. So there is a property owners certainly have rights, but they also have to understand that when they buy a sensitive piece of land, that there may be other issues that come to the forefront. So I certainly support the motion that was made by Mr. Hutchison and the second by Ms. Fote. There was a question, I think, Rick, you're okay with changing on that. So, all right, Mr. Mills changes. So is there no further discussion? I think that we can vote.
I'm sorry. Were there any amendments to that resolution? It's just as presented by the historic site.
Incorporating the suggestions of Mr. Mills.
Thank you. Motion carries 3-2. Councilmember Weigel, Mayor Pro Tem Mills voting no.
We will now, unless we need a recess, we will move into the Planned Development District. Okay, so we will continue. Council.
Mr. Mayor, if I can,
Yes,
I'd point
Mr.
out that with the designation of the entire site as historically significant, it may be appropriate for the council to consider returning the PDD to the Historical Preservation Board for the conformity review that's called out in the resolution.
Do we need a motion?
Yep.
So moved then. But will we be returning it to the developer or returning it to the?
To the Historical Preservation Board.
Okay. So that would be my motion.
Motion by Ms. Fote. Well, the second by Mr. Hutchison. Any discussion, Council? Okay.
Yes, Mr.
Mills.
Mayor. I think from my spot, sitting up here on council, I'd like to give some information that I think that if the lofts project is going to go forward and go back through the process as the motion is, that I'd like to give a little guidance from my standpoint, and I think it's based on things that we've heard not only from up here but also from the audience, and that is that I think it's too overpowering on the west elevation. I think it needs to be pushed back and certainly not come out beyond the line of the original building, the historical building. I think that based on that and our downtown guidelines, that then there's requiring additional stepping in that facade on the west also that would be or would need to be modified. So I think that what I'm trying to do is give some potential to the applicant to look at other potential possibilities of how that could work, and I definitely feel that it is much too overpowering on the west, whether you agree with the project or not, just from an architectural standpoint. So I think that needs to be
clearly articulated in the minutes, so that gets moved into the staff report for Historical Site Preservation Board. Okay.
And then I think that based on that, there are other opportunities and things that can happen on that along with that project. And I think I would hope that anything that comes back in relationship to any further development on that site includes putting back the original retaining wall and restoring the landscaping as it was on the west and the south, on the north and the west. So I'm offering that as a suggestion to better qualify the architecture when it goes to HSBB and goes through the process before we come back here again.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mills. Mr. Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would also like to request that staff consider CEQA requirements and that they consider a focused EIR, considering the historic site, to go along with this whole thing. I think that that may be something that we overlooked initially with the PDD. So I request that we look at that and the requirement for that.
Okay, Rick.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I completely concur with Mr. Mills' observations. In addition, I'd point out that the AAC believed that this project was too close to the Santa Fe building. I think there should be more space between any future building on the lot, more open space. It should be appropriately parked, not underparked. And I do think it should be step back not just on the fourth floor, but more gradually, as Mr. Mills observed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Ginny.
I think Mr. Hutchison just mentioned the two things that I wanted to talk about, and Mr. Mills, that there, if this building is eventually ends up being built, it should be built oriented towards Indian as opposed to oriented towards Palm Canyon. I mean, not that the front of the building should there, but it should be much further back on the lot, and the parking was of a major concern for me, because the parking in that area is really needed, and we just turned down a project a block away from this that didn't have adequate parking.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor by Ms. Foat with a second by Mr. Hutchison to send this back to the Historical Site Preservation Board.
Misvoted, didn't take your vote again.
I'm trying.
Did that time. Motion to refer the PDD application back to the Historic Site Preservation Board for conformity approval, unanimously carried.
Okay, thank you, Council. We'll now move to our second public hearing, unless anyone needs a recess.